Well, good evening. If you have your Bibles, would you please turn them to Job chapter 3. That's where we're going to be tonight. We've been continuing on with Job, and now we're going to get into, let's call it the meat of things. The main thrust of the book is these long statements from Job and these long statements from his friends, and then Job replying to those statements and talking about basically the why. Why does God do what he does? Why does suffering get allowed? And those are great questions, and we're going to see them asked over and over again. But let's think about it first. What does suffering and loss and brokenness and loneliness do to a person who trusts in God? What does it do to that kind of person? What does it cause them to think about? What are the thoughts that go through their heads? How does it process through their theology? You know, what they believe about God. When a Christian suffers, how does that work in their minds? You know, what questions do they begin to ask about God's goodness and who God is and why God does this? What are the kind of things that happen to a Christian? Because some people might want to believe that since someone is saved, they're impervious to some of the things that go through the minds of non-believers. That they don't get plagued with doubt and fear and all these feelings that come against God in some ways. And you know, but the truth is, we're not impervious. I think most of us probably know that. Christians suffer. Good, godly people grieve and deal with doubt and deal with fear and feelings of betrayal and abandonment in the same way that most people do. Pain still hurts, both physically and emotionally. Tonight we get a good picture of this in Job's words. I think it's key to remember as we get into chapter 3 what we've already been told about Job. We've seen this stated 3 times in chapters 1 and 2. We've been told that Job is blameless and he is upright. We've been told that he feared God and turned away from evil. Job was a spiritual giant. In fact, God made the statement in chapter 1 that there's no one on earth like him. And so I think it would be good for us to see how that guy, of all people, deals with trauma. Right? We could learn from this. And that's what we're going to see tonight. But before we do that, I want to give you some context of what chapter 3 is, because chapter 3, this is what is known as one of the books of poetry. So chapter 3 has got a little bit of a literary flair to it, if you will, okay? Job's not really talking to anyone in chapter 3. Even though his friends, we saw last week, his friends have come to grieve with him, and they're sitting there in silence with him for 7 days and 7 nights. And I told you last week, the traditional way that grieving would take place is they would sit in silence till the one grieving speaks. And so Job does break the ice with this statement, but he's not talking to them. He's if anything, just making a statement. He's pouring out his grief. There's a term for this. It's called lament. Job is lamenting. If you look up the definition of what a lament is, it's defined as a passionate expression of grief and sorrow. He's just letting it out. And it's dark, and it's ugly. And he's putting his grief into words. There are actually other places in Scripture where we find laments. You find several in the book of Psalms. You find some in the prophets, especially Jeremiah and also Ezekiel. In fact, there's an entire book in the Old Testament called Lamentations. And the whole book is Jeremiah lamenting over the devastation of God's people in Israel after Babylon came in. He's lamenting over the spiritual state of the people. And so that's what we have here. Job is lamenting over what he's experienced. And so we're going to read through this, and there's things I want to pull out for you. So let's start with verse 1 through 10. And just like I said, it's just him talking, the whole chapter. So after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those who curse it, who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan, let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. He would be fun at a party, right? Why does Job curse the day of his birth? Well, it's because that's the beginning of this journey of grief and sorrow that he's on now. I mean, how many times have we been going through something and we look back for the source of that trouble, and it might be years prior, and we do the same thing? I wish I'd never taken that job. I wish I'd never spent that money. I wish I'd listened to my parents, right? We do this all the time. Job's just going all the way back to the very beginning and saying that this day that I was born is a dark day. And he curses it. He rues the day of his birth. Something else in verse 8 that's interesting. He makes a curious statement. He says, let those who curse it, who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. What's he talking about there? Well, there were people, you could hire them to curse other people. We still have this in some pagan cultures today. You could hire them to curse the day that a child was being born. You could hire them to do that. So he's talking to them. He's saying basically, those people can join in on my cursing of the day I was born. And what they would do is, he says, those who curse, who would rouse up Leviathan. Now, Leviathan's a name that's going to come up later on in the book of Job. It's one of the many fascinating things. But Leviathan is something big and terrible, and he's saying those people who curse the day could rouse up Leviathan to destroy the day of my birth. And what is Leviathan? We'll get into him later in the book of Job, but Leviathan is this giant sea beast, this giant sea creature that sailors were terrified of and people were terrified of. And when you think of monster or evil, they would use the word Leviathan as just a general term. And was it a mythical creature that people feared, kind of like the Kraken, right? You release the Kraken. Or was it an actual sea beast that's still with us today? Or was it something prehistoric that's extinct? That's all kinds of debates over that. But what we have here is Job is saying, I want the day of my birth destroyed, so even those people who curse it, bring up Leviathan to take it out. Okay, that's the depth of his feeling here. So he laments the day of his birth, and then he proceeds to go deeper into his lamenting. So look at verse 11. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. So this is where Job begins to get even a little bit darker. Rather than talk about the day, now he questions why when he was born, why didn't he just come out and just die as a small infant? That would have been better, he thinks. And then verse 16, he goes even deeper and asks, instead of being born and actually being alive and dying, why was I not just stillborn and born dead? Again, his rationale here is what he's going through during this season of his life is so painful and so heartbreaking that life has lost all purpose. And he doesn't want to walk through this grief and pain. Notice in those verses, he believes to die at birth or to die in the womb to be preferable to living. He points to something here, rest. Did you see that? He calls it the rest of death. You know, when you die, you're at rest. There, things would be quiet, he says. He points to the fact that the great kings of the earth and counselors and princes who spent their lives building for themselves out of ruins and amassing wealth for themselves, even though he's blameless and he served others and he loved others, these people were selfish and powerful and rich, and they get rest. They get the death that provides rest. Why doesn't he? He goes on in verse 17 to point out that the wicked get to rest and prisoners get to rest. This rest of death comes upon them, both the small and the great, people who don't even deserve that kind of mercy. Yet here he is, still alive and still suffering. It's almost like Job is saying, that's not fair. Why do wicked people get to die and here I am suffering? Not fair. Remember, we saw this in chapter 2 when God allowed Satan to go and attack Job's health, but told him he could not kill him. And yet that's the very thing Job is wishing he had, was death. The fact that Job is alive and doesn't get to rest from his trouble through death, that's all part of this test of faith. There is a rest that's promised to those who look to Jesus Christ. And I read through this and I think about how does this tie to the New Testament? How does this tie to Jesus? But we have this, those who follow Jesus Christ, who hold to their faith through suffering and find rest in him, not in their own devices. Look what Jesus says in Matthew 11 on the screen. He says, "Come to me, all who labor and who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." We come to Christ, we hope in him, and we find rest. That's the promise. And yes, we have this rest as we live today in our physical bodies. It comes through the Holy Spirit. It's known as the peace of Christ that passes all understanding, right? That's promised to us in Philippians 4. But then we also have ultimate rest in Jesus Christ when one day our long life of heavy burdens is laid down forever, and we get this rest for our souls that Jesus is promising here. We've passed the test of faith, right? And that shows the genuineness of our salvation. We have to hold on to that. We have to remember that. When we suffer, that one day we will have true rest. It comes on the other side of suffering. But Job wants something different. He wants rest that pre-exists his suffering. I wish I was never born. I wish I was born stillborn. He wants to have what all of us would love to have, a pain-free life. A life with no suffering, no memory of this, no feeling of this. But that's not what we have. Who doesn't want what Job is asking for, right? But that's not what we have. Even Jesus promised that in this world you will have troubles. He says, take heart, for I've overcome the world. That's the promise we hold on to. So we walk through suffering, holding to God, hoping in rest, not lamenting that we didn't get it prior to. But that's what Job is doing. Look at verse 20. He goes on to say, "Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden from God, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water." So Job is now moved from talking about himself and the day of his birth to now asking questions about why does God do this? Or does God allow this, right? His first question is in verse 20. He asks why God allows people to live on in the midst of suffering. I mean, why doesn't God just put us out of our misery? That'd be more humane, wouldn't it? Rather than let us suffer, just somehow let us die. I mean, that would make more sense. Who wants to live in pain? When I read this points to something I've been reading a lot about lately in other parts of the world, this big ethical issue that's going on, the idea of whether assisted suicide is a moral, ethical thing. Is it a way to help people? Is it a way to bless them or minister to them, to help them to end their pain? Then there's this argument that is it playing God and doing something that we don't have the right to do and taking life? That's the back and forth, right? And it is different than taking someone off of life support and allowing what is already happening to happen. This is actually causing death. It's not a big deal in America right now, but it is huge in Europe. I don't know if you Google it, you can look up that in Switzerland they've come out with what's called the death pod. It looks like something from a space age movie. It's a pod that someone has ordered, and they place it wherever they want it, in a field, in their backyard, wherever, their living room, and the person gets in the pod, and music plays, their favorite music plays, and when they're ready, they push a button, and they die. And then someone comes and picks up the pod. That's real. You can look it up. There's all kinds of pictures online. It's a thing. I read an article, and I'm going to read some of it to you, a couple months ago. This is from March. It's a church in Canada. It's entering into the church, this debate, this ethical debate that I'm seeing when I read this with Job. This is the article. At around noon on March 9th, Betty Sanguine arrived at her church on a stretcher. The moment we rolled her in and sat her up in her recliner, she lit up like a Christmas tree, her daughter said. I hadn't seen that much life in her eyes. There was so much joy. And honestly, I think part of it was she was just allowed to be in her church again. But this was no ordinary church service. Betty had chose to die in the sanctuary that day. She had been diagnosed with ALS the year before, and she chose to access medical assistance in dying, and she wanted the procedure to happen in her church. The church leadership team unanimously approved her request, and on March 9th, the crossing over ceremony is what they called it, took place in the church's sanctuary. She could no longer talk, so she used a whiteboard to communicate, and she wrote on it, "Welcome to my special day. I love you all so much." Her grandchildren were all there, and they sang a few songs, a few hymns. Everyone then sang "How Great Thou Art" as a congregation. And everyone who wanted to say goodbye to Betty had their chance to walk by and hold her hand and talk with her. It was a very touching and very intimate time. Then the minister offered a blessing and commissioned her to go in peace. At that point, everyone left the sanctuary, but her kids. The medical team came in and Betty gave her final consent by signing one more form, and she passed on, and they carried her out. I've done a lot of things as a pastor. I've sat through a lot of services that things I've participated in that I wondered, is this okay or not? But I read this and I'm like, oh my goodness. I have so many conflicting emotions, okay? For one, I have sat with suffering people more times than I can count, and I've been asked by them point blank, why is God still letting me live? I just want to go home to be with my spouse. I just want to go home to be with my kids. I'm in so much pain, I want it to end. I have been there, I've had those conversations, and it's so hard because what do you say, right? This is where Job's at. In verse 23, he asks, why is the light of life given a man who is hidden in darkness, whom God has hedged in and won't let die? But not even Job talks about taking his own life. He theoretically talks about, what if I wasn't born? What if I was stillborn? But he doesn't talk about, I want to die and kill myself now. He dances around that several times, but he never goes there. Not even Job, with all of his suffering and all of his pain, kills himself. He doesn't. But we live in a world where Job's lament is now legally being answered with a humane, family-filled, church-framed way to stop the suffering on your own terms. Like I said, right now the conversation in America, there's other ethical debates right now in America with abortion, some other things that have taken prominence. But if you follow international news, this is there everywhere, and it's being widely accepted. I think when we look at Job and the way he suffers, we get a good guide on how to respond to that ethical debate. Also take note in our text, the very thing that was Job's blessing and protection in chapter 1. Satan said, you have put a protective hedge around Job. Why wouldn't he follow you? That's the very thing Job is referring to here as a curse to him. God has put a hedge on me. I can't die. So what was a blessing Job sees as a curse. Let's read the last two verses, verse 25 and 26. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I'm not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. In these last two verses, Job explains the why behind his lament and the why behind his questions. These are not just philosophical musings about life from someone who's observing at a distance. Job points out what he has feared has come upon him: the loss of his children. I have to believe that's the paramount thing. After reading in chapter 1 how he worried for their souls and offered sacrifices for each one. Yeah, his health is an issue, and yeah, his stuff is an issue, but the thing that he dreads the most, what is the thing that you dread the most? The thing that you fear losing more than anything else, whatever it is. Job's saying that's happened to me. That's where I'm at right now. He points out that he's not at ease. He's not quiet. He has no rest, and trouble is upon him. And then that's the end of our chapter. There is no resolution here. There is no happy ending here. It's just open-ended pain being vented out. What are we to do with this? Well, how many of us have had those moments? How many of us in the quietness of our pain have asked some of the same questions that Job has asked here? There are a few things I want to point out, and then we'll be done. First, I believe in this chapter, Job is looking for the purpose of his suffering. This is the reason for the why questions here, and he's going to continue to ask them throughout this book. His friends will respond to what he just said. He'll respond to them, and he asks why, and then he'll get some answers from God, and part of God's answer is you don't get to know why. That's something that's pretty unsatisfying. But that's where it goes. Instead, just know me is basically what God says. But Job is not alone in asking the why question. Jesus asked the why question, did he not, when he was on the cross? In whatever darkness he was suffering through, whatever physical pain he was feeling, and betrayal and abandonment from friends and the emotional anguish, what did he cry out on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? He asked the why question. And I point that out because if Job is asking the why question, and we're told that there's none on earth like him, and his righteousness is held out to us as exemplary, and Jesus asked the why question, Jesus being the Son of God, never committed a sin, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, it's okay to ask the why questions. It is okay to lament. Why, God? Why does this happen? Sometimes we feel like that's a sin in itself because we're showing too much, doubt or whatever. But you have good examples of folks doing that. And we should also understand that when you ask those questions, you may not get an answer like you want. There are the things of God that are hidden from us, and then there are the things of God that are revealed to us in his word. So you may not get an answer. Look at Deuteronomy 29 on the screen. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of the law. We may not get specifics, but we know from God's word that God allows trial to test us, to teach us, to shape us, to discipline us, to drive us to depend on him more. Those are all specific reasons given to us from the Bible. So we know that much. So it's okay to cry out to God and ask why. He's got big shoulders to lean on. And he may give you specific answers, but those are not guaranteed. Secondly, and I go back to this, Job is not suicidal here. I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth repeating. Job is not suicidal. He doesn't talk about taking his life. He doesn't threaten to take his life. He holds fast to his integrity, and part of that is respecting the gift of life that God has given him. The longing for death that he expresses is all theoretical in the sense that he talks about, what if I had died at birth? What if I had died stillborn? What if, it's not, I'm going to do this. He doesn't go there. In fact, remember when Job's wife a few weeks ago told Job, just curse God and die. What's she saying in that moment? There's a temptation there, right? To curse God. But she's reminding him that there is a way out of all of this for you. If you just curse God, if you blaspheme God, he'll kill you and you can die. So take the easy way out. And even in that moment, Job says no, and he rebukes her rather than take the easy way out. Suicide is a sin. Suicide is self-murder. It is God who decides when and how a person should die. That's not for us. It is God who gives life and God who takes it away. And Job even makes that statement when his children die. Lord gives, the Lord takes away. He believes that theology. So he doesn't go to, now I'll take. I don't believe that suicide is an instant ticket to hell, as some people teach. I believe that's more of a Catholic teaching. All suicides go to hell. But it is sin. It is disrespectful to God. It is not acknowledging the truth about God's sovereignty over life and death. And man, it is extremely destructive to those who are left behind. There are those who go through the long, dark night of the soul, and since they can't see the light on the other end of the tunnel, they tend to entertain thoughts of ending things prematurely, right? And some of us know that pain as we've dealt with maybe feelings ourselves, or we've dealt with loved ones or friends who are there, right? Just know that that's not a God-honoring direction to take. And I would encourage those people to seek help, talk about their issues with others, seek comfort from friends, family members, church members, professionals, because suicide is not okay. It is sinful. And I do not believe Job is suicidal. And I think that helps us as we think about Job in this book to kind of think about where he's at. Lastly, I believe Job is being forged. I believe that is what Job is doing, and God is doing in Job's life here. We don't get much of a sequel. The book of Job ends, and we get one little statement at the back end of the book that talks about Job's life after all this. And God does restore. But we don't get to see, how does Job live now? How does this experience change his perspective and change the way he parents and change the way he worships and changes the way he has wealth and all that stuff? We don't get to see that. But make no mistake, God was doing something through all of this, forging Job, shaping him, changing him. And that was a part of his life after this is all over with. Just as he shapes us through trials. One of my favorite verses is something that God says to the nation of Israel through the prophet Isaiah. Look on the screen, Isaiah 48:10. He says, "Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tried you in the furnace of affliction." I love the imagery that produces in my mind. God is the blacksmith, right? He's working me and shaping me with the forge and the hammer. It's hard, it's hot, but rough edges are being smoothed and taken out. Purpose is being molded into me. I'm becoming an instrument for him, right? Strength is given through fire as I become stronger and stronger. I believe that's what God's doing in the life of Job. Even as Job is processing things in chapter 3 through this lament, all of this is part of the process. And I just want to encourage you, those of you who are suffering, whatever it is, God is forging you, brothers and sisters. He has you in the furnace of affliction. It's painful. It may take a long time, but there's purpose behind it. Don't doubt that. Be encouraged by that. And hold on to him during that process. Beat on his chest during that process. Wail your laments during that process. But don't lose faith. Persevere. We will see Job do that through this book. This is a dark place now, and it continues for like 30 more chapters. But we will see him persevere. That being said, let's pray. God, you are good, and I thank you for your word. I thank you for the example you've given us in Job. As difficult as it is to watch someone suffer, even if it's someone we don't know and it's someone from thousands of years ago and we're just reading about it. Lord, this is not far removed from our experience. We suffer. We feel loss. We feel pain. We feel betrayal. We know those we love who are going through things like this. So God, I pray that as we read about this and as we think about this, that you help us to grow in faith. You help us to see you as the light at the end of the tunnel. You help us to remember that you hold out rest for us and peace for us. Help us to remember you never leave us nor forsake us. God, you are good.